Hello students, welcome to BBA 432. Today I will be covering which is about the export and import in international trades and the regulations surrounding exporting and importing. So let's start with the learning of objectives of this chapter, which is about explaining the principles and practices of exporting, and then we will later on discuss the motivations and methods of exporting practices, understand how the export startups begin their businesses and expand in international trade, explain the principles and practices of importing, and also articulate the motivations and methods for importing. And there are also problems facing international traders, so we will be looking at the nature of those problems and the pitfalls that challenge international traders. Define the standards of an export plan and also distinguish the principles and principles of counter trade. First, let's start with the learning objective 1, which is to define exporting, right? What is exporting? So exporting can be referred as the sale of goods or services produced by a firm based in one country to customers that reside in another country. There are different types of exporters. Those three types include non-exporter, sporadic exporter, and regular exporter. In the case of a non-exporter company, you will see that this type of company commands little to no knowledge about exporting and often has no interest in international trade. Okay. The second type of exporter includes the sporadic exporter. This type of company takes a passive approach to assessing international trade options. It fills an unsolicited order from the occasional foreign buyer, but prefers to focus on the domestic market. And then in the third category, we have a regular exporter. Regular exporter is the type of company that aggressively pursues export sales as a productive, profitable, strategic activity in another country. So this type of exporter, which is actively pursuing exporting products to other countries, is known as a regular exporter. So we continue in learning objective with describing the problems and pitfalls that challenge international traders. So some of the advantages associated with exporting is ownership advantage, right? In the case of ownership advantages, managers bundle resources and capabilities to develop core competencies that, in defining the firm's competitive advantage, influence if and how it enters foreign markets by exporting the products. But then we have the location advantages. Location advantages is all about the combination of high sales opportunity and low investment risk in foreign markets. So this combination of high sales and the low investment risk can create favorable export locations for the companies. And then there's also the internationalization advantage, right? So this type of advantage is all about companies often responding to uncertainties caused by market imperfections, by internalizing market processes. That is, for instance, by conducting a transaction within the controlled confines of the company rather than in the open, imperfect market. So exporting really creates this internationalization advantage by allowing the companies to respond to these uncertainties caused by market imperfections. So there is also complexity posed by differing cultural, political, legal, and economic environments, which sort of creates the problem of so-called liability of foreignness. So exporters in different countries are always subject to this notion of liability of foreignness, right? Liability of foreignness concept, indicating that there are different cultural, political, legal, and economic systems that impose different constraints on exporting companies. So this liability of foreignness, I'm emphasizing here, liability of foreignness, basically indicates or argues that foreign companies, by virtue of their spotty familiarity, incur additional economic and social cost of doing business overseas. So companies offset this liability by capitalizing on their advantages as well as selecting the mode of international business that best reflects their resource profile and risk tolerance. So exporting really sort of tries to minimize this liability of foreignness, even though it does not totally eliminate the problem. Okay? So the second learning objective of this chapter is to understand and articulate the motivations and methods of exporting. So what are those key motivations that enable the companies to export their products to foreign nations? Obviously, the first objective to increase the profitability, right? Exporting helps companies increase profitability. Exporting opens opportunities to increase profits. Often companies sell their products for higher prices abroad than at home. So foreign markets may lack competitive alternatives, right? Or they may be in different stages of the product's life cycle. The second opportunity, motivation, is to help improve productivity of the company. Exporting helps companies improve productivity, creating options to use scarce resources such as capital and labor more efficiently. Productivity is often linked to increasing economies of scale. Exploiting capacity or spreading costs over more customers improves efficiency. And then the third advantage is the advantage of diversifying the activities. Exporting diversifies activities, thereby fortifying a firm's adaptability to business cycles and disruptive innovations. Serving customers in different markets reduces a firm's vulnerability to the loss of a local buyer while safeguarding its bargaining power with suppliers. So our third objective is understand export startups and expansion of those startups in international markets. So we have these two notions here, incremental internationalization and born global phenomenon. In the case of incremental internationalization, the idea that was developed in the 1980s and the 1990s, basically this idea sees physical difference, cultural ties, and market circumstances fundamentally shaping how a company approaches and engages in exporting business. Right? Specifically, export activity follows a sequential process, which leads a company to sell initially from its home market to geographically and psychologically proximate countries. Okay, so the argument here is that the companies, especially the export startups, tend to export their goods to geographically and also psychologically and culturally proximate countries. From there, it methodically expands, systematically exporting to more dissimilar and distant countries. But they will be starting with the countries that they are more culturally and geographically familiar with. Okay? The second approach is the born global phenomenon, right? The born global phenomenon, so the international entrepreneurial literature basically talks about this born global phenomenon, which reports that some firms initiate exporting as a born global, also known as instant international, micronational, or international new venture. Okay, so some firms, in other words, initiate exporting as a born global phenomenon, right? Rather than methodically engaging a sequence of increasingly dissimilar foreign markets, as in the case of incremental internationalization, born globals step onto the world stage immediately upon their founding or soon after. Okay, so these type of companies do not engage in a sequence of increasingly dissimilar foreign markets. Rather, they step onto the world stage immediately, just after their founding or soon after. So they regard their home as just one of many opportunities in the world. Okay? Our fourth learning objective is to explain the principles and the practices of importing. So we have three approaches or practices of exporting: direct exporting, indirect exporting. And then later on we will discuss which approach is the best or the most optimal approach to use. Okay? In the scenario of direct exporting, the company directly sells its products to an independent intermediary, such as an agent or a distributor or a retailer outside its home country. The intermediary then sells the product to the local consumer. Direct exporting requires a company manage the export process, minding all aspects of making and marketing the product. Whereas in the case of indirect exporting, some companies prefer to do the indirect exporting, what they do best, sometimes outsource the rest of the practices. In this situation, they enlist independent distributors, agents, or export management companies to ship, market, and sell their goods abroad. Operationally, the company sells its products to an independent intermediary in the domestic market, which then exports the products to foreign agents, who then sell it to end consumers. So the idea here is to sell the product to an intermediary in the domestic market first, and then that intermediary will be responsible for exporting the product to its agents in the foreign market, and that agents will then sell the product to the customer. Learning objective 5 is about the articulate the motivations and the methods of importing. There are several reasons that sort of enable that motivate, so to speak, that motivate the exporters, and several reasons that motivate importing also. Okay, those several reasons that motivate importing, the first of them is the specialization of labor. Right? Managers usually divide a production process into a sequence of separate yet interdependent steps and assign workers to particular steps so that one worker does one task, another does another task, and so on. The specialization of labor organizes production to achieve economies of scale, as well as exploit location economics, such as the advantage associated with the location economics, such as different wage rates and material costs in different locations. The second, obviously, the motivation is the input optimization. Input optimization. The companies import goods from foreign suppliers in order to lower their costs. This is imperative in industries where competitive rivalry imposes persistent cost pressures, such as we see in telecommunications and business services. And then we have the local unavailability. Right? The WTO identifies the expanded scope of choice as the chief benefit of import. Importing lets local markets improve the variety of their offerings, providing consumers with products that are either unavailable locally or that can serve as competitive substitutes to local options. Okay. And the last motivation is diversification. Importers, like exporters, diversify by tapping international markets to develop options. Right? So tapping to develop options is a very important motivation for importers. Diversification through importing lets companies find higher quality, lower cost products and services, thereby making it less vulnerable to the dictates of a local supplier or business cycle. So there are further motivations for importers, and those motivations, right, sort of create a certain portrayal of an importer. Like we have different portrayals of importers, right? So who are these importers? There are input optimizers, and there are also opportunistic importers. Okay. So let's cover input optimizers in addition to opportunities, this one, and arbitrageurs, right? In the case of input optimizers, you see that this type of importer uses foreign sourcing to optimize, in terms of price or quality, the inputs fed into the supply chain. Okay, and then there are also opportunistic importers, which look for products around the world that it can import and profitably sell to local citizens. And then we have arbitrageurs, right? Arbitrageurs. So arbitrage, the meaning of arbitrage is such that in theory, a good sold in one market should sell for the same price in another. So in practice, prices vary due to gaps resulting from market regulations, trade inefficiencies, political risks, and other factors. There are a lot of problems and pitfalls to exporting, financial risk being one of them. So basically, financial constraints pose tough impediments to international traders. So if you look at a survey of 978 small to medium enterprises, when asked their perceptions of trade barriers, they said that the greatest problem was the shortage of working capital to finance exporting. So the financial concerns also include payments and taxation. These type of constraints affect both small and big companies in manufacturing and services. And there's also the customer management issue, which is an enduring barrier to exporting, mostly which is about the misunderstanding, the difficulty of profitably serving customers in foreign markets. There is the international business expertise. Sometimes international traders, like most managers dealing with foreign markets, must understand local business practices. There are marketing challenges, which are all related to high shipment costs, logistic demands, weak foreign market connections, difficulties in matching foreign rival prices, and effectively lack of means to effectively promote products and establish distribution networks. Okay, there is also the problem of the top management commitment to exporting, right? Sometimes management characteristics, especially executives' international outlook and risk orientation, influence export and import activity. Government regulation is another barrier to exporting, right? Exporting and importing always face inefficiencies that are pertaining to delays, documents, and administrative fees. The rules and regulations governing trade, notwithstanding with the success of the WTO, still endure. Then there's also the issue of trade documentation, right? Which is a problem related to red tape and the battery of documents that regulate international trade. And exporters and importers have to file those documents and regulations before engaging in international trade. Here are some of the further barriers to exporting. This table describes some of the common barriers to international trade, especially the relative influences of the common barriers to export. Please read this table or review this table very, very carefully. Some very specific barriers, there are some specific examples that are listed as barriers to exporting, such as transportation costs, language, cultural barriers, U.S. taxation issues, lack of trained staff, handling, exporting, importing, high tariffs, most importantly, government regulations, right? Lack of government support programs for exporting, obtaining financing is another important challenge, visa issues, unable to find foreign staff and partners, and other issues related to filing documents, customs procedures, and so forth and so on. Again, this table describes some of the trade documentation required for exporting, which is sometimes seen as a major barrier to exporting because there's a lot of technical details, a lot of red tape involved, a lot of trade documentation required for engaging in export business, such as bill of lading, certificate of origin, commercial invoices, consular invoices, export packaging lists, pro forma invoices. So please review these documents carefully to have a better understanding of some of the complications related to exporting business. And the learning objective 7 is all about some of the resources and the assistance that help international traders. The first assistance comes from the public agencies, especially U.S. Commercial Service Office. Agents in the United States can start at the nearest commercial service office that operate as a trade promotion arm of the U.S. Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, right? So these government-related units promote trade and investment by particularly helping small to medium enterprises that export goods abroad. And also we have private agencies that help or assist exporting firms. We have export management companies, EMC, which acts as the international trade arm of a company, helps the firms establish overseas markets. There is export trading company, which is ETC. Basically, in 1982, the United States government instituted the Export Trading Company Act, right? Thereby permitting U.S. firms to collaborate with each other to reduce their export costs, improve export efficiency, and in return, compete more effectively in export markets. There is something known as freight forwarders, popularly known as the travel agent of cargo, which is the largest export-import intermediary in terms of the value and weight of products shipped internationally. So these travel agents of cargo, they sort of, upon finalizing a foreign sale, the exporter hires a freight company, also known as a travel agent of cargo, which acts as an intermediary by offering terms of the value and weight of products shipped internationally. And there's a third-party logistic, TPL, third-party logistic. This agent is a fast-growing force in international trade. Like freight forwarders, third-party logistics move cargo across global markets. However, unlike freight forwarders, they collaborate with manufacturers, shippers, and retailers to relieve them of the logistics responsibilities of transportation, warehousing, cross-docking, inventory management, packaging, and freight forwarding. And we have in the last category, brokers trading. Brokers trading internationally requires understanding relevant customs regulations and policies. So these are the agents basically dealing with international customs regulations and policies. They know how to clear goods through customs. They assist with assigning the appropriate customs duties and complying with special procedures. This table outlines some of the questions that should be asked when putting together an export plan. Doing the export plan is pretty much like a strategic plan. You need to go through certain steps and ask the right question, which can be a very challenging but a rewarding process in the long run. So export planning is pretty much like strategic planning. So you need to consider the following questions throughout the process, which can improve the quality of your analysis. Is exporting consistent with our vision and mission? So it has to be really consistent with the objectives and the mission and the vision that is laid out in the company's strategic planning. Do we see ourselves as a sporadic or regular exporter? Would our resources be better utilized in developing or domestic businesses? Does exporting leverage our ownership advantages? Do our internationalization advantages support export activity? Do targeted export markets provide location advantages? How much will it cost to get the product to the foreign market? What is the best mix of public and private assistance? So these are some of the things that successful exporters should take into account, should consider before going overseas or exporting their products overseas. The last objectives in this chapter is to distinguish the principles and the practices of counter trade. So counter trade. So let me explain what counter trade is by considering the following transaction. So let's assume that Coca-Cola has traded its syrup for cheese from the Soviet Union, oranges from Egypt and tomato paste from Turkey, beer from Poland, and soft drink bottles from Hungary. Okay? Let's assume that Malaysia swapped palm oil for fertilizer and machinery with North Korea, Cuba and Russia, and also negotiated similar deals with Morocco, Jordan, Syria, and Iran. Thailand, for instance, the world's largest exporter of rice, uses rice for oil deals with Middle Eastern countries. For instance, Boeing exchanged 10 747 for 34 million barrels of Saudi Arabian oil. So what the countries do in the case of counter trade, right? They swap certain things. They trade their goods for another good by exchanging a good from another country, right? For instance, Chinese companies most of the time agree to build a coal mine, a power station, and a dam in Zimbabwe, with the revenue from the mine being used to repay the loan. Okay? These sorts of trade fall under the umbrella term counter trade. There is products are exchanged directly for products of equal value without the use of cash or credit. Okay? So these sorts of trades fall under the term counter trade. Any one of the several different arrangements that parties use to trade products via transactions that use limited or no currency or credit quality can be qualified as a counter trade. Okay? So table 14.5 illustrates different types of counter trade. Like one of them is barter, the other one is buyback, offset, switch or swap trading, counter purchase. Please carefully review this table because they all fall under counter trade, and the table 14.5 tells you, it illustrates how the companies engage in different types of counter trade. Again, thanks for listening to my lecture. In this lecture, I talked about exporting and importing business, instruments of importing and exporting, and different motivations and the rationales for companies to export their goods overseas. In the next chapter, I will be talking about foreign direct investment and the different theories of FDI, which might shed some interesting highlights on the exporting business as well. Thanks again for listening to my lecture, and see you in my next lecture. Have a good day. Bye-bye.